So when I first read Elie Wiesel's Night, it was as if I was stepping into another world. But what I was really doing was I was stepping more deeply into our world, a world that has always included profound suffering and injustice. But the truth is, this has been going on for the entirety of the human enterprise, the human experience. And there are places and people who experience unimaginable horror in Rwanda or Myanmar or Darfur or Armenia, people who have experienced the horrors of genocide, as Wiesel and his family and friends and millions of Jews experienced in the Second World War. Wiesel, whose mother and younger sister were killed at Auschwitz and whose father died at Buchenwald, experienced Job-like suffering. And like Job, Wiesel was a good and faithful Jew. As a child, he studied the Talmud and the Torah, and he had this deep sense of God's presence and God's guidance in his life. But like Job, he became a God accuser, raging against God for allowing such horror to happen in the world. When Wiesel was in his concentration camp and Yom Kippur was upon them, the people in the camp just were talking with each other whether or not they would celebrate Yom Kippur. It was a time of prayer and fasting and repentance, the holiest of holy days in the Jewish calendar year. And so many people said, why should we fast when we barely have enough food to exist? And so many people did fast and praised God on this day of Yom Kippur, but not Wiesel. Wiesel writes in Night, "There was no longer any reason for me to fast. I no longer accepted God's silence. And as I swallowed my ration of soup on Yom Kippur, I turned that into a symbol of rebellion, a protest against God." That day, Elie joined Job and many people of faith through the ages, including Jesus himself, who prayed, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Last week, we heard Job railing against God. He said, "I'm not keeping any of this quiet. I'm laying it on the table. Are you going to put a muzzle on me, God? I hate this life. Leave me alone. Can't you even let me spit in peace? Even suppose I'd sinned, Lord, how would that hurt you? Don't you have better things to do than to pick on me?" And this week, believe me, the raging continues, but there are moments of inexplicable hope, or maybe just hopeful longing that we heard Jim and Liz read. And here are just a few. Job says to God, there is hope for a tree that is cut down, that it will sprout again. He appeals to God and understands that the wrath will pass, and he asks God to remember at a set-apart time in the future. And he says, I know that my Redeemer lives, that I shall see God. In his suffering, Job looks deeply at creation, at God's creation. He looks deeply at the nature of time, and he looks deep within his own heart. And when we find ourselves losing hope in our own lives, we can follow Job's lead. We can look at what's happening in God's creation. We can look at the nature of time, and we can search our own hearts. So I want to look at those three things today. We can look deeply at God's creation. For those with eyes to see, we see that there is life and death and rebirth happening all over the place. Science may use different words, different metaphors, different symbols, but they point, scientists do, to the same reality. That there is something that is constantly being reborn in this world. Words like condensation, evaporation, hibernation, the 4 seasons of winter, spring, summer, and fall. We see this dying and being reborn happening in the life cycles from salmon to stars, constantly dying and being reborn of the same stuff, the same stardust. Whether or not we use the word God, there is something resurrecting everything all the time, everywhere. And Job sees this when he looks at that stump and he realizes that stump will sprout again. I think Jesus was inviting the disciples to see this very thing when he was preparing for his death, and he was preparing them for his death. Remember what he says in the Gospel of John. He says, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it falls into the earth and dies, it bears much fruit. The resurrection isn't just something to believe in. It's something to observe all around us in creation, in the undoing of death and the bringing forth of life. The resurrection is happening all the time, everywhere, for those with eyes to see. I learned recently that there are certain pine species in places like Colorado and California who've experienced the horror of these raging fires. And these certain species have developed a very thick and hard cone that is able to hang on to the tree for years, and it contains within this cone mature seeds, but it's sealed and glued with this very strong resin. And it is only when fire sweeps through the forest and melts the resin that the heat-dependent cones open up, releasing the seeds that are then distributed by the wind and gravity all throughout the forest, regenerating it. When we're losing hope, we can look at God's creation, and we can also look at the nature of time. The story goes that years ago, an Eastern monarch charged his wise men with a task to come up with a phrase that would be true all the time and in all circumstances. And so they went throughout the world searching for that phrase until they finally found it. And they came back to the monarch and they said, here's the phrase that is always true everywhere, all the time. This too shall pass away. Maybe someone said that to you. Maybe you wanted to smack them for saying it. People have been saying that through the ages. Rumi has said it. Abraham Lincoln said it. In fact, here's what Lincoln said. He said, this too shall pass away, expresses so much. It is chastening in the hour of pride and consoling in the depth of affliction. It pushes against that inclination in all of us to want to stop time and hold on to it when things are going well. And that part of us that wants to move quickly through it when things aren't going well. But have you ever tried it? Can you stop the hands of time? Can you make things go any quicker than they're going? It's true that we can't do this. It is not in our power. But it's also true that nothing lasts forever. Nothing. Somebody posted recently, this too shall pass. It might pass like a kidney stone, but it will pass. I think mature spirituality is about learning how to savor the gifts and the blessings, to see them and to savor them with all of our heart. And at the same time, it's learning how to hang in there and hold on when things are really, really hard. Because Rumi and Lincoln and so many others are right who've said, this too shall pass away. When we find ourselves losing hope, we can look at God's creation, we can look at the nature of time, and we can look into our own hearts. Let me offer 2 simple practices that you can do. They don't take much time. The next time that you're at the food store, with your to-do list, stop for 1 minute and just look around and see what's happening all around you. See the mother trying to keep her child occupied while she's getting items from the shelf. See the father who's gathering the ingredients together to make a meal for his family. See the clerk say, "I hope you have a good day." Take a minute and see love all around, happening everywhere, all the time. Or tomorrow when you wake up, here's something you can do in the privacy of your own heart. Before you get out of bed and put your foot on the ground and start your day, stop and ask, what am I getting up for? What am I getting out of bed to do? What am I living for? Who am I living for? I suspect if you go into your heart with that question, you will discover love that exists and dwells within you and is moving you all the time, whether you name it or not. Somebody in our Tuesdays group shared with me these reflections from Thomas Halleck on Paul's statement at the end of his letter to the Corinthian church. Faith, hope, and love abide, and the greatest of these, Paul says, is love. And here's what Halleck wrote. He said, the minute we die, faith and hope die because we don't need them anymore. And the only thing that lasts and that remains in the end is love, the overwhelming love of God. Do you trust, as our tradition teaches, that you and me, we are created in the image of love? Do you believe, as our tradition teaches us, that God is love? Do you believe that love is the force that moves all the stars and the planets and keeps this universe going? Do you believe that love sustains every single breath and heartbeat in your life? And if you do, why would you ever be afraid to stop and pay attention to what's always happening? I think that's what Job does, and he gives us permission to pause in our lives and to trust our own experience when we look at creation, when we look at the nature of time, and when we search our own hearts. Because when we do that, our understanding of God will change. It will shift away from this impersonal God, uninvolved in our lives. A God who just set this thing in motion and has stepped away, and who could never suffer because he's all powerful, the great patriarch in the sky. It's unworkable. And when we pay attention, we realize it's not true. It's not true. Because someone who can't love isn't, or someone who can't suffer isn't able to love. How could God love you and me? How could God love God's creation and not suffer? And when did we think that a suffering God was weak and not powerful? I think we haven't read our gospel. I mean, it's all there. God becomes human, vulnerable like us, letting go of all the privileges of God to live life as we do every single day of our lives. And this God defended the poor and the vulnerable, and he fought against injustice and was falsely accused by the religious and political authorities, put to death and executed. And we think God is invulnerable to suffering? Jürgen Moltmann, the great theologian, says, not only is the crucified Christ God, it's God's way of saying, this is who I am. This is what I'm about. A God who is love is a God who can suffer with us. And the good news is God is love. A deathless love that cannot, will not, does not die. And in the end, faith and hope will die. but love and love alone will remain. And in our time of suffering, we can stay connected to the deathless love that moves the stars and the planets and sustains every breath and heartbeat. And we can do that even when we're angry, and especially when we're angry, because when we're angry, who do we get angry with? We get angry with the ones we love. And anger is a part of love. The opposite of love is not anger, it's indifference. And when we keep that relationship intact, even when we're angry with God, we are staying connected to that love that cannot die. And the temptation that we must avoid in our hearts is to become indifferent. American poet William Stafford invites us into this mystery in such a poetic and beautiful way. And I want to take 3 or 4 minutes now. And I want to stop talking about this mystery. I want to invite you into it. I want you to think about a place of suffering in your life, a place maybe of confusion right now, or a place of frustration in your life. It could be a relationship, it could be a job situation, some place of suffering and sorrow. It could be the death of a loved one or the impending death of a loved one. It doesn't matter what it is, but be in the suffering, be present to it, and acknowledge your powerlessness to fix the situation. It's got to be something you can't fix. And I want you to be open to how God may be calling you to hang in there and to hold on. How you might stay connected to the crucified Christ, a God who loves you enough to suffer with you. So I'm going to read this poem. Debbie's going to play some music to undergird our time of prayer. But I invite you to pay attention to your life and to what's happening in it. Stafford writes, "There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread. But it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die. And you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread." in the midst of your suffering. Bring to your heart's eye the image of a thread. Imagine it being there with you in the midst of the suffering. And imagine you taking it into your hands. For there's a thread you follow, and it goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread. But it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen. People get hurt or die. And you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. You don't ever let go of the thread.